It's interesting too because, you know, you're talking about the history of horror and you have to get the grandchildren, you know, the descendants of these original characters. But you talk about the history of heavy metal, which basically only started specifically late 60s, early 70s. And you have somebody like Alice Cooper, who not only is one of the first guys to do horror in heavy metal, he's one of the first guys to do heavy metal, period. So I thought that's kind of cool when you're talking about the history, and that horror goes back to caveman times. Heavy metal goes back to, you know, I was born in 1970, basically right at the beginning of my life. So when you get someone like Alice out there, because there's so much to talk about from a metal side, the horror side as well. And then even talking about Prince of Darkness and his relationship with John Carpenter, who's also in the movie. I thought that was really cool too. We've never really seen that before, how Alice even ended up in that movie and how integral he is to both sides of the coin.
And it was great because he told his side of the story from Prince of Darkness, and John Carpenter, who's also in the film, told his side of the story. So I was able to intercut their interviews together to help tell the story, you know, together. So, yeah, I mean, Alice, basically, they were friends, and he showed up to the set just to kind of hang out. And John Carpenter just grabbed him and, you know, trying to kind of dragged him in for a small part, and that's how he ended up in the movie.
I saw Prince of Darkness probably only once. I need to rewatch it, but I remember that death and explain what Alice did and where Carpenter got the idea from it, because he just basically wrote the scene on the spot, right?
Yeah. So John says, I guess Alice had a thing he'd do on stage where he'd take like a part of a bicycle and jam it through someone, or he'd stick something through. He'd impale someone with like a pole or whatever. So John knew about that. So then when they were on set, I guess they had this part of a half bicycle or something like that, where there's a pipe sticking out of it, a bar sticking out of it, whatever. So, so Alice, you know, confronts this guy. He blocks him in the hallway, in the alleyway. Yeah. Right. And then he takes the bicycle stand. He just impales the guy with, with the bike. So that's how it ended up in the movie, because Alice was doing this type of stuff on stage. So John wanted to bring that into the movie. And that was, it was just like, it wasn't really planned way in advance. It's just something that kind of happened while they were shooting.
How was it that you were able to get John Carpenter? Once again, that's a huge get for the horror, you know, from the horror world.
Yeah, that was a cool one because, again, Rob had brought me on board. Rob has a studio in Burbank.
Zombie?
No, sorry, Rob Lucas,
gotcha.
Who's producer on the film and good friend. So he worked it out with John to do two of John's music videos, because Carpenter, he was doing, he had a new album coming out, and he wanted to do, he redid Escape from New York and Distant Dream, and a new one called Distant Dream. So his new musical tracks that he put together. So he wanted two new music videos. So I was brought on board to do second camera, and then I also edited both videos. So we were working with him. What did we shoot? We actually shoot that. We shot that at a sound stage, actually, in LA. So we shot it there, and then we came back to the studio. I cut it there, and then when John came over to watch them, he loved both videos, and it was very cool. And kind of throughout that process, we said, hey, you know, we're doing this documentary called The History of Metal and Horror. Would you sit down for a few minutes to do an interview? So because we were working with him on his videos, he was kind of as a favor, he sat down with us to do the interview for this. Well, so that's kind of how we built that relationship, which was very cool.
How was he as an interview?
He was cool. He's very direct.
Yeah.
Very to the point. He doesn't like to dilly dally. He likes to get it done and get out. But yeah, he was very cool. Gave a lot of great answers. And just amazing to have one of the biggest horror directors in the world, you know, sit down with us for a little bit. It was fantastic, you know, because I mean, I'm such a huge fan of his movies too. And,
absolutely.
I mean, Prince of Darkness, I saw it in the theater when it was out, and I can't remember how many times I saw that, but also like In the Mouth of Madness, which is something that doesn't get a whole lot of attention, is also one of my favorites to this day. So
it's interesting too, because I didn't even realize this till I watched the Anthrax documentary of their 40th anniversary, that they did the soundtrack for The Ghosts of Mars, which of course is like another Carpenter kind of early 90s forgotten film. Another band, I know Charlie's very much obsessed with horror, as is Scott. You mentioned even the lyrics that he wrote for Anthrax. Yeah,
Scott, he definitely talks about just being influenced by horror and comic books. Stephen King books specifically were really really inspired him a lot. And Charlie as well. And he's, he loves bands like Ghost, who kind of bring on this horror look. And he talks about the album cover. First Ghost album cover is like the same design as Salem's Lot, right? So we talk about album covers too. Like so many album covers are kind of horror artwork, and that's sort of designed to catch a person's eye and say, oh my God, look at that. Like the first Iron Maiden album.
Yes.
Scott talks about that as well, being a young guy in a record store, seeing this album cover with Eddie on the cover. And I know you talk a lot about Eddie as well in the doc. But yeah, so we talk about that as well, as like you see this horror imagery on an album cover, which is unusual for the most part. And it makes you just kind of pick it up and kind of take a chance on it. So,
that was a huge thing. Basically, I think the crux of this really started in the 80s when, that I still remember Killer's album cover being like terrifying. Like as a kid, it came out in 82. So I was 10 or 11. Like it was creepy. Like you were scared by this thing. Like, oh my gosh, like I don't even know if I want to read this. That one was bad. Hell Awaits was bad because the demons, like just pulling this guy's head off and eviscerating him. Like we're all been so desensitized now in 2021, but in 1984, the heavy metal bands were putting horror on their album covers that literally scared you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember, I think I was in, walking with my parents in downtown Albany when I was a kid, and I saw Eddie for the first time and on the outside of on a poster outside of a record store, and I'm like, holy shit! I'm like, what the
Yeah,
like that's some creepy shit that you don't normally see.